The waves crashed rhythmically against the shoreline, their soothing roar blending with the laughter of vacationers scattered along the sun-drenched beach. I sat on the edge of a lounge chair, toes buried in the soft, warm sand, staring out at the horizon where the endless blue of the sky met the restless ocean. This was supposed to be my escape, a chance to reclaim a sense of self I'd somehow lost over the years. No deadlines, no laundry, no arguments about who forgot to buy coffee. Just me, the sun, and the sea. Mark, my husband, had insisted I take this trip. "You need a break," he'd said with a kind smile that felt more like a peace offering. We'd been together for 9 years, and while our relationship hadn't unraveled, it had thinned at the edges, like an old quilt losing its stitching. His encouragement for me to travel alone had seemed selfless at first, but now I wasn't so sure. Was it a gesture of love or indifference? I tried not to dwell on it, shaking the thought away as I reached for my sunglasses and a bottle of water. That was when I first noticed him. He stood at the water's edge, his tall frame silhouetted against the golden sunlight. His hair, sun-bleached and wind-tousled, fell just above his shoulders, and his skin glistened, a testament to countless hours spent under the sun. He was laughing with a group of people, gesturing toward a row of surfboards lined up on the sand. His confidence was magnetic, and even from a distance, I could feel the energy radiating off him. I looked away quickly, embarrassed by my staring, but something in me flickered, an unfamiliar flutter of excitement I hadn't felt in years. The next morning, I found myself wandering toward the surf school by the beach. I told myself it was about trying something new, embracing adventure. But deep down, I knew it was curiosity. When I arrived, he was there, crouched beside a board, waxing it with methodical precision. "Hey," he said, looking up with an easy grin that revealed straight white teeth. His eyes, a piercing shade of green, locked onto mine. "You here to surf or just to watch?" Surf, I guess," I stammered, feeling like a teenager with a crush. His confidence was disarming, but not in an overbearing way. It was as if he knew exactly who he was and didn't need to prove it to anyone. "I'm Ryan," he said, standing and extending a hand. "Laura," I replied, shaking it. His grip was firm but warm, and I felt a jolt of electricity that left my heart pounding. Ryan was patient as he guided me through the basics of surfing. He stood behind me, his hands on my arms as he adjusted my stance on the board. "You've got to trust the wave," he said, his breath warm against my ear. "Let it carry you." By the end of the session, I wasn't much of a surfer, but I couldn't stop smiling. My muscles ached, my hair was a tangled mess of salt water and sand, but I felt alive. Ryan's laugh was contagious, and the way he looked at me, like I was the only person on the beach, made my skin tingle. We spent the rest of the week in a whirlwind of sun and surf. We shared beers at the beach bar, swapped stories about our lives, and laughed until my cheeks hurt. He was everything Mark wasn't: spontaneous, uninhibited, and utterly captivating. On the third night it happened. The bar had cleared out, leaving just the two of us under a canopy of stars. Ryan's gaze lingered on mine a beat too long, and before I could second-guess it, his lips were on mine. The kiss was electric, igniting something deep within me I'd forgotten existed. My heart raced as his hands traced the curve of my back, pulling me closer. For the first time in years, I felt desired. Alive. Free. As the week drew to a close, reality began to creep back in. I couldn't ignore the text messages from Mark, asking if I was enjoying myself, if I was feeling better. Guilt settled like a stone in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to tell Ryan. He didn't ask about my life back home, and I didn't offer. It was easier that way, keeping this connection in its own perfect, untarnished bubble. The morning of my departure, Ryan walked me to the edge of the resort, his hand brushing against mine. "You don't have to leave," he said softly, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite name, hope maybe. "Stay." I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But the image of Mark flashed in my mind. His steady presence, his quiet loyalty. The life we'd built together wasn't perfect, but it was real. And no matter how thrilling my time with Ryan had been, it felt like a dream, a beautiful, fleeting escape from reality. "I can't," I whispered, tears pricking my eyes. Ryan nodded, his expression unreadable. He leaned in, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to my forehead. "Take care of yourself, Laura," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. On the flight home, I stared out the window, my heart heavy with conflicting emotions. When I stepped through the front door of our house, Mark was waiting, his face lighting up in a way that made my chest ache with guilt. He pulled me into a hug, his arms familiar and comforting. "How was it?" he asked, his voice full of genuine curiosity. "It was good," I replied, forcing a smile. My throat tightened as I fought the urge to tell him everything, to confess, to seek absolution. But as I looked into his eyes, I realized I couldn't bear to shatter the life we'd built. That night, as I lay in bed beside Mark, his steady breathing lulling me toward sleep, I thought about Ryan. His laugh, his touch, the way he'd made me feel. I didn't know if I'd made the right choice, but I knew this. Some things are better left as memories, beautiful and bittersweet, untouched by the harsh light of reality. The days after my return felt strangely hollow. I had stepped back into my life with Mark, the life that I had built brick by brick over the past 9 years, but I felt like a stranger in my own home. Everything was in its place. The coffee mugs in the cabinet, the laundry basket by the washer, the faint hum of Mark's late-night TV shows. But I felt displaced, like a piece that no longer fit the puzzle. Mark, bless him, didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did but chose not to ask. He had always been that way, quiet, steady, and unassuming. He asked about my trip with polite curiosity, never pressing when I offered vague answers about relaxing by the beach and trying something new. But inside me a storm brewed. I couldn't stop thinking about Ryan. His voice haunted me in the quiet moments. His laugh echoed in my ears when Mark wasn't looking. I'd catch myself zoning out, staring at the ocean in my mind's eye, reliving the way Ryan's hands felt on my skin. It was intoxicating and maddening all at once. I told myself it would fade. Surely, this obsession would burn itself out, leaving me with nothing but a fond memory. But days turned into weeks, and instead of fading, the ache grew stronger. I started to resent Mark for his contentment, for the way he seemed so at peace while I was unraveling inside. One evening, as I was scrolling mindlessly through my phone, my fingers hovered over the search bar. I knew it was a terrible idea, but the temptation was too strong. Before I could stop myself, I was typing, "Ryan surf instructor. Resort name." It didn't take long to find him. His Instagram was a vibrant tapestry of sunlit beaches, roaring waves, and smiling faces. And there he was, in picture after picture, radiating that same effortless charisma that had drawn me to him. I hesitated for a long time, my thumb hovering over the follow button. I knew this was crossing a line, but hadn't I already crossed so many? Finally, I pressed it, my heart pounding in my chest. He followed me back within an hour. The first message came the next morning. "Ryan. Didn't think I'd hear from you again. How's the real world treating you?" I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. I should ignore it, I thought. I should delete the app and pretend I'd never seen it. But instead, my fingers moved on their own. It's fine. But not as exciting as life by the ocean. The conversation flowed easily after that. It was as if no time had passed since we'd parted. Ryan's messages were playful and flirty, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper. Something that made my heart ache with longing. He asked about my life, my dreams, the things that made me happy. Questions Mark hadn't asked in years. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, waiting for his replies. Every buzz of a notification sent a thrill through me. A rush of adrenaline that I hadn't felt in so long. It was addictive. Mark started to notice the change in me. "You've been on your phone a lot lately," he said one evening, his tone casual but laced with curiosity. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, just catching up with some friends," I lied, feeling a pang of guilt. He nodded, accepting my answer without question, and I hated him for it. I hated how easy it was to deceive him, how little he suspected. But more than that, I hated myself for what I was doing, for the secrets I was keeping, the lies I was telling. One night, after a particularly heated exchange of messages with Ryan, he suggested something that made my heart skip a beat. "Ryan, come back. Even just for a weekend. We'll pick up right where we left off." I stared at the screen, my mind spinning. The idea was reckless and impossible and thrilling. The thought of seeing him again, of feeling that spark that had ignited between us, was almost too tempting to resist. But then I thought about Mark. About our home, our life together. About the promises I had made when we stood in front of our families and said, "I do." Could I really throw it all away for a fleeting moment of passion? I didn't reply to Ryan that night. I put my phone face down on the nightstand and tried to sleep, but the thought of him consumed me. The next day I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, torn between two worlds. I needed clarity, closure, something to help me move forward. I booked a flight back to the resort. I told Mark it was a girls' weekend. A chance to reconnect with some old friends. He didn't question it. He kissed me goodbye at the airport, his touch warm and familiar, and I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly made me turn back. But I didn't. When I arrived at the resort, Ryan was waiting for me. He greeted me with that same easy grin, his arms pulling me into a hug that felt like coming home. For the next 2 days we fell back into the rhythm we'd found before. Surfing, laughing, stealing kisses under the stars. But something was different this time. The magic wasn't as effortless, the passion not as all-consuming. Maybe it was the weight of what I'd left behind, or maybe it was the realization that this, whatever it was, could never last. On the last night, as we sat on the beach watching the waves roll in, Ryan turned to me, his expression serious. "Stay," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "We can make this work." For a moment I considered it. The idea of leaving everything behind, my life, my marriage, my responsibilities, was both terrifying and exhilarating. But deep down I knew the truth. "This isn't real," I said, my voice breaking. "It's beautiful, but it's not real. I can't live in a dream." Ryan looked at me for a long time, his green eyes searching mine. Then he nodded, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I get it," he said. "But for what it's worth, you made my world feel real. Even for just a little while." When I returned home, Mark was waiting for me, just as he had before. But this time when he asked how my trip was, I didn't offer vague answers. I told him about the waves, the sunsets, the way the ocean made me feel alive. I told him the truth, well, most of it. And as I spoke, I realized something. My time with Ryan hadn't been about him, not really. It had been about me. About rediscovering the parts of myself I'd forgotten. The parts I'd let wither away over the years. I didn't know if Mark and I could fix what had broken between us, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we had a chance. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days after my second trip were quieter, though no less turbulent beneath the surface. I'd come home with the resolution to mend what I had with Mark, to reignite the connection we'd once shared. But good intentions are easy to voice and harder to act on. Each morning I woke beside him, his familiar presence both comforting and stifling. I longed for the simplicity of our early years together when love had been effortless and untainted by the slow erosion of routine. Mark tried in his own way. He started planning little date nights, making a point to ask about my day, even surprising me with flowers once, a gesture that had made my heart ache with guilt more than gratitude. I in turn tried to reciprocate. I cooked his favorite meals, laughed at his jokes, and leaned into his embraces even when my mind wandered elsewhere. But there was a distance between us now, a chasm that neither of us knew how to bridge. I found myself retreating to the safe haven of my phone more often than I should. Though I had stopped messaging Ryan, his profile remained a temptation I couldn't resist. I would scroll through his pictures late at night, reliving those fleeting moments of freedom and passion. It was a bittersweet form of self-punishment, a reminder of what I'd had and what I'd chosen to leave behind. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room with Mark, the silence between us grew too loud. He was watching some crime drama, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the TV, while I absently scrolled through my phone. "Are you happy, Laura?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the stillness. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. "What do you mean?" I asked, stalling. He muted the TV and turned to face me. His expression wasn't angry, just tired. "I don't know. You've seemed different since you got back. Distant. I want to know if you're happy. If we're happy." The lump in my throat was suffocating. I looked at him, at the man I'd promised to love and cherish, and felt a wave of shame so intense it nearly knocked me over. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He just waited, his patience both a comfort and a curse. "I've been feeling lost," I continued, struggling to find the right words. "It's not you, Mark. You're a good man, a wonderful husband, but I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I want. His silence was unbearable. I half expected him to get angry, to demand answers I couldn't give, but instead, he just reached for my hand. Then let's figure it out, he said softly. Together. In the weeks that followed, we tried. Truly we did. We went on long walks, had deep conversations, and even attended a couples workshop, a recommendation from one of Mark's colleagues. At first it felt forced, like we were two actors playing roles in a script we didn't fully believe in. But slowly something began to shift. There were moments, brief but powerful, where I caught a glimpse of the man I'd fallen in love with, and of the woman I used to be when I was with him. But the past has a way of lingering, of seeping into the cracks no matter how hard you try to patch them. One evening, as Mark was out running errands, I received a message that sent my heart racing. Ryan, hey, just wanted to check in. Hope you're doing okay. I stared at the screen, my pulse thundering in my ears. It had been months since I'd last heard from him. I thought I'd moved on, or at least buried the feelings deep enough that they couldn't surface. But in that moment, everything came rushing back. I didn't reply. I couldn't. Instead, I deleted the message and tossed my phone onto the couch, as if putting physical distance between us could sever the emotional ties. But the damage was done. His words lingered in my mind, a reminder of the life I'd glimpsed and let go. The following weekend, Mark and I hosted a small dinner party for some friends. It was his idea, a way to bring a little levity into our lives. I threw myself into the preparations, hoping that the distraction would quiet my restless thoughts. As the evening unfolded, I found myself laughing more easily than I had in weeks. The wine flowed freely, the conversation was light and engaging, and for a brief moment, I felt a spark of normalcy. Mark was charming and attentive, his hand resting on the small of my back as he introduced me to his colleagues. But then out of nowhere, one of the guests, an old friend of Mark's, asked a question that made my stomach drop. So Laura, I heard you went to Resort Name recently. How was it? The room fell silent, all eyes suddenly on me. My grip tightened on my wine glass as I forced a smile. It was beautiful, I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. The beaches were amazing. Did Mark join you? She asked, her expression genuinely curious. No, I replied quickly. It was just me. A little solo getaway. Oh, those are the best, she said with a knowing nod. You come back feeling so refreshed. I offered a polite smile, but inside I was unraveling. The conversation moved on, but my mind stayed stuck on that moment, replaying it over and over. Did Mark's friend suspect something? Did Mark? Later that night, as we cleaned up the remnants of the party, I caught Mark watching me. What? I asked, trying to sound casual. Nothing, he said, shaking his head. But his tone was off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something back. The weeks turned into months, and the cracks in our marriage began to widen. We were trying, but the weight of my secrets was a constant presence, a shadow that loomed over every interaction. I knew I needed to tell Mark the truth, that we couldn't rebuild our relationship on a foundation of lies. But every time I thought about confessing, fear paralyzed me. Would he forgive me? Could he? One night, as I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, I realized that I couldn't keep living this double life. I had to make a choice, not just between Mark and Ryan, but between the person I was and the person I wanted to be. The next morning, as the sun filtered through the curtains, I turned to Mark and took a deep breath. We need to talk, I said, my voice trembling. And with that, I began to unburden myself, piece by painful piece, laying bare the truth that had been eating away at me for so long. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in months I felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to start anew, no matter how difficult the journey might be. The words came haltingly at first, like a dam slowly cracking open. Mark sat across from me at the kitchen table, his coffee untouched, his expression unreadable. I started with the easy parts, the loneliness, the sense of disconnection, the feeling that I had been drifting away from myself as much as from him. He didn't interrupt. He didn't accuse or react. He just listened, his steady gaze fixed on me as I unraveled years of pent-up emotions. But when I reached the part about the resort, about Ryan, his face changed. The soft understanding in his eyes hardened into something I couldn't place. Hurt? Betrayal? Maybe even anger. I met someone, I said, my voice cracking. It wasn't planned. It wasn't supposed to happen. But it did. Mark's jaw tightened, and he looked down at the table. I could see his hands clenching into fists, then relaxing, as if he was struggling to keep himself under control. The silence between us stretched unbearably, and I filled it with words I wasn't even sure he wanted to hear. It wasn't about him, I continued, desperate to make him understand. It was about me. About feeling alive again, about remembering what it felt like to matter. But it's over. It's been over. I came back because I wanted to be here, with you. I know that doesn't make it right, but it's the truth. He exhaled sharply, finally looking up at me. His eyes were red, his voice low and measured. Why are you telling me this now? Because I can't keep lying to you, I said, tears streaming down my face. I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not. I want us to have a chance, Mark. A real chance. But that can't happen unless I'm honest with you. For a long time he didn't say anything. The weight of his silence was suffocating, and I felt like I was drowning in it. When he finally spoke, his words were like a knife to my heart. I don't know if I can do this, he said quietly. I don't know if I can forgive you. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Mark stayed in the house, but we were like strangers living under the same roof. He barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were clipped and cold. I tried to give him space, but the silence between us was unbearable. Every time I saw him, I wanted to beg for his forgiveness, to tell him that I would do whatever it took to fix things. But I knew that wasn't what he needed, not yet. I started seeing a therapist, hoping to make sense of the mess I'd created. She was kind but firm, helping me peel back the layers of guilt and shame to get to the root of my actions. You can't rebuild your marriage by focusing on what you've done wrong, she told me during one session. You have to figure out what you want going forward, and whether that aligns with what Mark wants. It was a terrifying thought. What if Mark didn't want to rebuild? What if he decided that the damage was too great, that our marriage wasn't worth saving? The possibility of losing him was a constant ache in my chest, but I knew I couldn't force him to forgive me. All I could do was try to become the person I wanted to be, someone I could be proud of, with or without him. One evening, about 3 weeks after I'd confessed, Mark came home from work and sat down across from me at the dining table. I'd been flipping through a magazine, pretending to read but really just trying to distract myself from the tension that hung in the air. Laura, he said, his voice hesitant. I put the magazine down, my heart pounding. Yeah. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking down at his hands. I've been thinking a lot about us. About everything you said. I held my breath, afraid to speak, afraid of what he might say next. I won't lie to you, he continued. I'm angry. I'm hurt. And part of me wants to walk away from this, from us. But there's another part of me, a bigger part, that remembers why I fell in love with you in the first place. And that part of me wants to try. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I reached across the table for his hand. To my relief, he didn't pull away. I want to try too, I said, my voice trembling. I know it won't be easy, but I'll do whatever it takes, Mark. I'll fight for us. He nodded, his grip tightening on my hand. We'll need help. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. But if we're going to do this, we need to do it right. No more secrets. No more lies. Agreed, I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. No more lies. The weeks that followed were a slow, painstaking process of rebuilding. We started couples therapy, where we laid everything out on the table, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Mark's anger boiled over, when he threw my betrayal back in my face and I had to sit with the weight of my actions. But there were also moments of connection, glimpses of the love that had brought us together in the first place. One night, as we sat on the couch watching an old movie, Mark reached for my hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. I looked over at him, and for the first time in months, I saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. We're going to be okay, he said softly, as if trying to convince himself as much as me. I nodded, squeezing his hand. Yeah, I said. We are. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were no grand gestures or sudden resolutions. Our marriage didn't magically transform overnight. But little by little, we started to find our way back to each other. We took walks together, talked late into the night, and learned to laugh again. The wounds were still there, but they began to heal, one small step at a time. And through it all, I learned something about myself, about the kind of person I wanted to be and the kind of love I wanted to give. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose the future. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally choosing the right path. As the months unfolded, the fragile progress Mark and I made began to feel more stable. Therapy became a cornerstone of our new foundation, a space where we could confront the ghosts of the past without fear of judgment. There were sessions that ended in tears, his and mine, where raw emotions bubbled to the surface, unfiltered and painful. But there were also moments of breakthrough, moments where the weight seemed to lift just enough for us to see each other clearly again. One session in particular stood out. Mark had been quiet for most of the hour, his expression hard to read as I shared my feelings about what had driven me to the brink of our relationship. When the therapist asked if he had anything to add, he looked at me, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I felt like I was losing you long before you went on that trip," he admitted. "And I didn't know how to fix it. I thought giving you space would help, but maybe that was my way of avoiding the problem." Avoiding you. His words hit me like a tidal wave, not because they were accusatory but because they were so honest. For the first time I realized that our drift had been a two-way street. While I had been consumed by my own unhappiness, he had been quietly struggling with his own doubts and fears. And in that moment I saw the cracks not as proof of our failure, but as evidence of our shared humanity. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," I said, my voice breaking. "I should have let you in instead of running away." Mark nodded, his eyes glassy. "And I should have fought harder to keep you here with me." Our therapist interjected, reminding us gently that blame wouldn't help us move forward. What mattered now was the commitment we were making to each other, to listen, to communicate, to stay present in the relationship we were rebuilding. Life didn't stop just because we were working on our marriage. The world outside of us continued to spin, demanding our attention in 1,000 little ways. Work, family obligations, social events, all of it required energy that sometimes felt like it was in short supply. But through it all, Mark and I found ways to stay connected. We started having weekly date nights, a ritual that felt both awkward and necessary at first. Sometimes we went out to dinner or a movie. Other times we stayed home and cooked together, laughing as we stumbled through new recipes. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping romance. It was about being present with each other, carving out time to nurture the bond we had almost lost. One night, as we sat on the back porch sipping wine and watching the stars, Mark reached over and took my hand. "Do you ever think about what happened?" he asked, his voice soft but serious. I hesitated, unsure how honest to be. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not the way I used to. It's not a part of me anymore. It feels like it happened to someone else in another life." He nodded, seeming to understand. "I think about it too," he said. "Not as much as I used to. But when I do, it's not just about the hurt. It's about what it taught me." I looked at him, surprised. "What did it teach you?" "That love isn't just about being there for the easy parts," he said, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of my hand. "It's about staying when things get hard, when it's messy and painful and you don't know if it's worth it. But then you remember why you started in the first place. And that's what keeps you going." His words stayed with me long after that night, a reminder of how far we'd come and how much further we still had to go. As the seasons changed, so did we. Slowly, the shadow of my mistakes began to lift, replaced by something new, something stronger. It wasn't the naive, carefree love we'd had when we first got married. It was harder, more complicated, but also more real. We had seen each other at our worst and chosen to stay anyway. That, I realized, was its own kind of beauty. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out the attic, I stumbled across an old photo album. Inside were pictures from our honeymoon, sunlit snapshots of a younger, happier version of ourselves. I flipped through the pages, smiling at the memories but also feeling a pang of sadness for the innocence we had lost. When Mark came home that evening, I showed him the album. He laughed at the goofy faces we'd made in some of the pictures, his laughter warm and genuine. "We were such kids," he said, shaking his head. "We were," I agreed. "But look at us now." He glanced at me, his smile softening. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" "Yeah," I said, leaning into him. "We really have. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges of pain." A year after my confession, Mark and I found ourselves in a place I never thought we'd reach. A place of peace. The scars were still there, but they no longer defined us. We had learned to carry them without letting them weigh us down. One evening, as we were sitting by the fireplace, Mark turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you regret telling me the truth?" he asked. I considered his question carefully. "No," I said finally. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the right thing. Keeping it inside would have destroyed us." He nodded, his eyes searching mine. "I'm glad you told me," he said. "Even if it hurt. Because now I know we can get through anything." His words filled me with a quiet kind of hope. The kind that isn't flashy or dramatic, but steady and unyielding. The kind that builds a life. And as I leaned into him, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft rhythm of his breathing, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. Not perfect, not without flaws or regrets, but whole. And that was enough. Years passed, and the chapters of our life unfolded in ways we never could have anticipated. The wounds from that tumultuous period faded into the background, becoming just another thread in the complex tapestry of our marriage. There were new challenges to face. Aging parents, career changes, even moments when the spark between us dimmed again. But we faced them with a resilience forged in the fire of what we had endured. Mark and I learned to communicate in ways we never had before. We didn't wait for resentments to fester, or for misunderstandings to grow into insurmountable walls. When something felt off, we talked about it even if it was uncomfortable. And in those conversations we found a deeper intimacy, one built not on the illusion of perfection, but on the acceptance of our imperfections. One day, as we celebrated our 15th wedding anniversary, I caught myself reflecting on how far we'd come. We were at a small, cozy restaurant, the kind of place we would have picked in our early days of dating. Mark reached across the table, his hand enveloping mine, and smiled. 15 years, he said, shaking his head slightly. "I can't believe it." "Neither can I replied with a laugh. "But we made it." He nodded, his expression growing serious. "You know, there was a time when I wasn't sure we would. But now, I can't imagine life without you." His words brought tears to my eyes, and I squeezed his hand tightly. "Me neither," I whispered. "I'm so glad we fought for this." That night, as we walked home under a canopy of stars, I realized that the life we had rebuilt wasn't perfect, but it was ours. It was real, messy, and beautiful in its own way. The love we shared wasn't the same as it had been when we were young. It was deeper, richer, and more enduring. As we climbed into bed, Mark pulled me close, his arm wrapping around me in a way that felt both familiar and new. "Good night, Laura," he murmured, his voice soft and steady. "Good night, Mark," I replied, my heart full. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew with certainty that we had not only survived, we had thrived. The road had been long and difficult, but it had brought us here, to this moment, where love and forgiveness had created a bond stronger than any we had known before. In the end, it wasn't about forgetting the past but learning from it. It wasn't about erasing mistakes but building a future where they no longer defined us. And that, I realized, was the true beauty of love. It wasn't perfect, but it was worth every struggle, every tear, and every hard-won victory. Mark and I had found our way back to each other, and in doing so we had found ourselves.